Something happens in the body when you stop trying to fix it. The breath deepens on its own. The shoulders drop. The jaw unclenches. This is where the next 3 hours begin, not with effort, but with that. Buddhist teachings have known for 25 centuries what the body already knows. Peace is not something you build. It is something you uncover, layer by layer, simply by learning to stop covering it. In the next 3 hours, you will hear teachings that work, not because they are complex, but because they are true. A frog sitting by a pond will show you what effortless presence actually looks like. A man who bowed 10,000 times until his forehead bore the permanent mark of it will show you what it means to give yourself to something completely. Water falling 1,500 feet will say something about living and dying that no other image quite manages. These are not metaphors invented to comfort you. They are records, ancient, verified, tested across centuries of human difficulty. They have steadied minds far more restless than yours. They have worked for people who came in with far less than you are bringing right now. The teaching at the center of all of it is this: the mind you have, uncertain, imperfect, unfinished, is not a problem to overcome. It is the exact right place to begin. Find a comfortable position. Let the weight of the day start to lift, and let this come to you. Something happened to you roughly 20,000 times today, and you probably noticed it for less than a minute total. You breathed. Not the breathing you are doing right now, because now you are paying attention to it. The other kind. The breathing that continues while you are arguing, while you are anxious, while you are so absorbed in a task that the body disappears entirely from awareness, except as a vessel for getting things done. The breathing that keeps going in the middle of the night when no part of the mind is available to supervise it. That has continued, without your management, every single day of your life, through grief and fever and heartbreak and distraction, faithful to a rhythm nobody taught you and nobody can take away. Buddhist teachings have pointed at this for 25 centuries. Not as a relaxation technique, not as a metaphor for something more important happening elsewhere, as a direct route into one of the most quietly liberating truths available to a human being. You are not as separate from the world as you have always assumed. And the breath is the proof, happening right now, inside this body, with or without your awareness, with or without your permission. Consider what is actually happening in the chest right now. The air currently inside your lungs was, 4 seconds ago, part of the room around you, part of the world outside your skin. It had been moving through the space between things, carrying no intention to enter you, belonging to no one. Then the chest opened, pressure shifted, and it came in, not because you invited it, but because the body created the conditions and the air simply responded. In a few seconds it will leave again, warmer than it arrived, carrying carbon dioxide, carrying traces of your body's chemistry back out into the shared air of the room. Someone in this building will breathe it. A plant on a windowsill somewhere will convert it. It will cross oceans in the slow current of the wind and enter the lungs of someone who will never know it passed through yours. This is not poetry. The oxygen in your blood right now was produced by organisms that lived before any human walked the earth. The water cycling through your cells has been rain, has been river, has been ocean, has been ice, and will be all of these things again long after it leaves you. You are assembled entirely from material that was here long before you arrived, and will continue long after you leave. The breath is simply the most available reminder of this, the one that arrives every few seconds, without ceremony, without rest, without ever asking for your approval. The boundary between you and everything else is real, and it is also, every few seconds, completely open. Stay with that for a moment, not as an interesting idea to file away, but as something happening right now, in the chest, as these words arrive. The boundary opens. It has been opening, without your knowledge or consent, for every single breath of your entire life. There is an image in Zen teaching for this. A swinging door. Not a heavy door, not the kind with a deadbolt and a weather-sealed frame that locks the outside out. The light kind, the kind that hangs freely in a doorway and moves in both directions, pushed open with equal ease from either side. There is no preferred direction, no resistance to one side over the other. Whatever comes from outside moves it inward. Whatever comes from inside moves it back. It does not hold a position. It does not resist movement. It simply responds to whatever arrives, completely, and then returns to the center. This is the breath. Air presses in from the world. The door swings inward. The body releases. The door swings back. In, out, world into body, body back into world. Over and over, without effort, without fail. And this, the teaching suggests, is what we actually are. Now here is the question that unsettles the whole picture. Where is the one doing the breathing? Not where is the breath. That is easy. You can feel it moving in the chest right now. But where is the fixed, permanent, self-contained being that is supposed to be behind all of this? The one who decides when to inhale and when to exhale, who stands entirely apart from the process and manages it from some fixed location inside the body. Look honestly for that being, not with the intention of finding a particular answer. Just look. There is sensation. There is awareness of sensation. There is the movement of the chest, the subtle shift of the belly. There is the experience of air crossing a threshold, but a solid, stationary I, standing fully apart from the whole process, running it from the outside. Nowhere you can point to. Or rather, not there in the way we have always assumed. What is actually there is more like the door itself. A movement, a responsiveness, something that happens rather than something that simply is. Here is why this matters. Beyond the intellectual, there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from maintaining the conviction that you are a sealed, fixed, independent thing, an exhaustion so habitual, so thoroughly embedded in daily experience, that most people have stopped recognizing it as exhaustion at all. It is the effort of drawing the line constantly between here and there, between this self and everything that is not this self, between what belongs to me and what belongs to the world. The mind has been drawing this line since childhood, and it has gotten very good at it. Walk into a room, and within seconds the mind has sorted everything: what is yours, what is not, what is safe, what requires monitoring. This is not a flaw. It is a remarkable and necessary capability. But any capability applied without rest, without counterweight, eventually becomes rigid. The line gets mistaken for a wall. The wall requires maintenance, and the maintenance never stops. Not during meals, not during conversations, not fully, even during sleep. The breath has been quietly crossing that wall your entire life. It crosses without asking, every time, without exception. Take one deliberate breath now, not a deep dramatic breath, not a performance of breathing. Just let the air come in at whatever depth it naturally seeks. Feel the chest open. Feel the belly soften forward. Feel the body do in 1 second what it has done flawlessly across every second of your entire existence. Then, without deciding when, let it go. Not push it out. Let it go. Feel the difference between those two instructions. The chest releases on its own. The air finds its way back to the room. The door swings back. You did not do that. It happened. This is not a small thing. Most of what we call rest still has a self at the center of it, managing the resting. The body settles, but the mind keeps running. The phone goes down, but the loop of the day continues. What the breath reveals, if you genuinely let it, is something different from any of that. A process that requires no management. That runs better, in fact, when management steps back entirely. That has never once, in the whole history of this body, needed your permission to continue. This is deeply unusual in a life structured around effort. Most things require tending. Relationships, work, health. These all need attention to sustain them. But the breath tends itself. It is the one thing in your life that has always been completely reliable, completely present, and completely indifferent to whether you are grateful for it. When that recognition lands, not as a concept but as a felt experience in the body, something loosens that did not know it was held. Not the muscles, something underneath the muscles. The particular effort of insisting you are a sealed thing in a world that keeps, with every single breath, demonstrating otherwise. You can feel it if you look honestly, not a dramatic sensation, just a slight easing, like the moment a room that has been slightly too warm finally finds the right temperature. Nothing dramatic, something real. What tends to happen when even a little of that grip releases is that things become more vivid rather than less. Sounds arrive more clearly. The specific weight of the body against whatever holds, it becomes more real. The breath itself deepens without effort, not because anything has changed, but because there is slightly more attention available to receive it. The defended self uses a great deal of energy. When some of that is released, it does not disappear. It returns to the present moment, which turns out to contain considerably more than the defended self ever allowed in. There is a rest that opens here, not the rest of finishing work, which still happens to a self who will begin again in the morning. This is closer to the rest of a hand that has been gripping something for so long it forgot it was gripping, and then, without drama, simply opens. What releases is not anything valuable, only the effort of holding, and the hand opening is lighter than it has been in a very long time. You do not disappear when this happens. That is worth saying plainly, because the fear is real. If the boundary softens, something essential might dissolve. But what actually happens is the reverse. When the grip eases, there is more available, more clarity, more sensation, more genuine contact with what is actually present, rather than with the defended version of it the mind has already prepared in advance. The swinging door does not vanish when you stop holding it shut. It simply becomes what it always was, moving freely in both directions, receiving and releasing with equal ease, without preference, without resistance. 25 centuries of Buddhist practice rest on this one physical, available right now observation. Not on belief or ritual, or the acceptance of any particular doctrine. On the breath. On the direct experience of air crossing the threshold between world and body and back again. And on what that simple crossing reveals about the nature of what we call the self. The inner world is limitless. The outer world is also limitless. There is no practice required to make this true. It is true right now, through every breath you draw, through every breath you have ever taken, and through the swinging door of each one, inside and outside have always been one whole world. Let the door keep swinging. Let the breath keep moving in its old faithful rhythm. The conversation between inside and outside has never stopped. Not once in your entire life, not in your most difficult moments, not in the times you felt most enclosed. The door was always swinging. The air was always moving. The inside and the outside were always in contact. A mind that truly feels this does not come apart. What it loses is the low, constant, invisible strain of holding everything at a distance. And what comes in to fill that space is something that has no grand name. Simply room. The kind that does not come announced. The kind that does not require you to be ready for it. The kind that arrives not from changing your circumstances or clearing your schedule, but from noticing that the walls you believed were sealed have always had a door in them, swinging freely in both directions, never once fully closed, always already open, waiting only for you to feel it. There is a Tang Dynasty Chan master named Tozan who said something about mountains and clouds that sounds, at first, like a nature observation. It is not. He said, "The blue mountain is the father of the white cloud. The white cloud is the son of the blue mountain. All day long they depend on each other without being dependent on each other. The white cloud is always the white cloud. The blue mountain is always the blue mountain." Sit with that for a moment before trying to understand it. Not because it is obscure, but because it is the kind of observation that the thinking mind wants to process too quickly and thereby miss entirely. The cloud forms from the mountain. The moisture that rises from the mountain's slopes and forests becomes the cloud that drifts above it. In that sense, the mountain made the cloud. The cloud is the mountain's child, formed from the mountain's own substance. And yet the cloud moves freely. It drifts where the wind takes it. It changes shape continuously. It is not the mountain and does not behave like the mountain. And the mountain does not chase it or call it back or insist it stay a particular shape. The mountain simply remains, solid, rooted, entirely itself, the cloud entirely itself, dependent and independent at the same time. This is one of the most precise descriptions ever given of what a mind at peace with itself actually looks like from the inside. And it is also, in a quieter way, a description of the only approach to the mind that has ever genuinely worked. Most of us have spent years trying to control our thoughts. Not in any dramatic way, not with white-knuckled suppression or rigid discipline, though those have been tried too. The everyday version is subtler than that. A thought arrives that we do not like, an anxious loop, a critical voice, a memory that surfaces at the wrong moment, and something in us immediately moves against it. We argue with it. We try to reason ourselves out of it. We distract ourselves away from it. We tell ourselves firmly that it is irrational, unhelpful, something a calmer person would not be having. And the thought, reliably, gets louder. This is not a personal failure. It is a structural one. The control approach contains its own undoing. Because the moment you move against a thought, you have given it a fixed point to push back from. The struggle itself makes it real, makes it significant, makes it something that must be dealt with before you can have peace. And peace that depends on successfully dealing with something is not peace. It is a ceasefire, temporary and exhausting. The Zen teaching on this is not gentler control. It is not better management techniques or more sophisticated strategies for handling difficult thoughts. It is something structurally different, something that sounds almost irresponsible when you first hear it. Give your sheep a large, spacious meadow. That is the way to control them. Not a fence, not a pen, not a disciplined system for keeping them exactly where you want them. A meadow, wide enough that they can go where they go, graze where they graze, wander to the edges, and come back again without anything being broken. The space itself becomes the container, not because the sheep are now constrained. They are less constrained than they have ever been, but because in a large enough meadow, they do not need to be constrained. They simply are what they are, within a field large enough to hold them. The mind is the sheep. The meadow is the awareness that watches the mind without flinching, without moving against what it sees, without deciding in advance what should and should not be present. You may have tried meditation and found your mind completely ungovernable. The thoughts kept arriving. The attention kept sliding away. The self-criticism about how badly you were meditating arrived on top of everything else, compounding the noise. And you concluded, somewhere along the way, that your mind was simply not cut out for stillness. That other people had some faculty you were missing, that the quiet others seemed to find was simply not available to you. The flaw in this conclusion is not that you are wrong about your mind. The flaw is in what you were trying to do to it. You were trying to make the sheep stay still. You were trying to build a smaller and smaller pen, and the smaller the pen, the more agitated the sheep. The more agitated the sheep, the more convinced you became that stricter control was needed. The instruction from Tozan, from 25 centuries of Buddhist practice, from every teacher who has actually sat with this long enough to find out what works, is the same. Stop trying to control. Start trying to watch. Watch without preference for what arrives. Watch without moving toward the thoughts you find agreeable or away from the ones you do not. Watch the way the mountain watches the cloud, utterly still, entirely itself, making no effort to shape what forms from it and drifts away. The thought arrives. It is seen. It moves through the awareness. It passes. Another comes. It is seen. It moves through. It passes. The awareness in which this is happening does not change between one thought and the next. It is not shaped by the thought, dirtied by the thought, diminished by the thought, or improved by the thought. It is simply there. The way the mountain is simply there. The way the meadow is simply there. This is the blue mountain. This is what you actually are. Underneath the cloud watching and the sheep chasing and the exhausting daily effort of managing the contents of your own mind. Returning to Tozan's image, the white cloud is always the white cloud. The blue mountain is always the blue mountain. The cloud changes shape continuously, moves with the wind, appears and disappears. The mountain does none of these things, and the mountain is not troubled by the cloud. It does not need the cloud to stop moving before it can be still. It is still already, fundamentally, regardless of what the cloud is doing. Your thoughts are the cloud. What watches the thoughts is the mountain. And here is what shifts when this is genuinely felt, rather than understood as a concept. The thought that has been causing the most trouble, the anxious loop, the self-critical voice, the worry that wakes you at 3 in the morning and will not leave, loses a particular kind of power when the watching is steady. Not immediately, and not through suppression, through something quieter than that. The thought continues to arrive, but the mountain does not move toward it, does not argue, does not try to make it leave faster than it is inclined to leave. Simply watches, simply remains. And without the struggle to give it energy, without the resistance to make it feel significant, without the attention of a mind at war with itself, the thought does something that controlled thoughts never get the chance to do. It moves through. Not quickly, necessarily, not without some discomfort, but through. The cloud drifts across the sky, and then it is gone, and the sky is the same sky it was before the cloud arrived. Watching is not passive in the lazy sense of the word. The mountain is not passive. Stillness is not passivity. It is a different quality of presence entirely, one that requires more genuine stability than all the fidgeting management and counter-arguing the agitated mind produces. To sit with an uncomfortable thought and simply watch it, without moving against it or away from it, is one of the more demanding things a human being can do. Most people find control easier to attempt, even when it fails, because control feels like doing something. Watching feels like doing nothing. And a mind trained since childhood to equate action with progress finds watching almost intolerable at first. This is why the meadow image matters. The meadow is not nothing. It is a generous, deliberately created space, large enough that what it contains can be itself fully, can move without hitting a wall, can settle when it naturally settles rather than when it is forced to. The farmer who gives the sheep a large meadow is not absent. The farmer is watching, attentive, present, available, but not intervening in every movement the sheep make, not trying to arrange them into a tidier pattern, not treating every wandering toward the edge as a crisis requiring immediate correction. The watching itself is the care. The space itself is the structure. Try this now, simply and without pressure. Notice whatever is currently moving in the mind. Do not name it or analyze it. Do not decide whether it is the kind of thought you should be having at this moment. Simply notice that it is there. Notice that you are aware of it. Notice that the awareness itself, the thing doing the noticing, is not the thought. The cloud is not the sky. The sheep is not the meadow. The thought is not the mind that watches the thought. Feel the difference between those two. The thought moves. The awareness watching it does not. The thought has a quality, anxious, heavy, circular, sharp. The awareness has no quality at all. It is simply open, simply present, simply the meadow in which whatever needs to move, moves. In Zen practice, the instruction for sitting is deceptively simple. When thoughts come, let them come. When they go, let them go. Do not chase them out. Do not invite them to stay. Do not be bothered by them. What you are looking for is not a mind empty of thoughts. That is not stillness. That is suppression. And suppression is the opposite of what is being pointed at here. What you are looking for is the quality of awareness that can hold any thought without being moved by it. The blue mountain, the large meadow, the sky that does not change between one cloud and the next. The dependent and the independent at the same time. The mountain that made the cloud and is completely free of it. Both things entirely true, neither one cancelling the other. When the listening mind can hold that, when the awareness is spacious enough that even the difficult things can move through it without triggering a war, something eases that most people have never consciously felt ease before. Because most people have been at war with their own minds for so long that the war feels like weather, like something simply true about the nature of being alive. And the first time the watching genuinely opens into spaciousness, the first time the meadow is truly large enough, there is a quality of relief so specific and clean that it is almost surprising. Not because the thoughts stopped. They did not stop. Because the war did. What Tazan understood, what the Zen tradition has returned to in every generation, is that the mind at peace is not a mind from which everything difficult has been removed. It is a mind spacious enough that difficulty can move through it without becoming an emergency. The white cloud crosses the sky of the blue mountain, and the mountain does not call it a problem, does not try to reroute it, does not label it as evidence that something has gone wrong with the sky. The cloud is simply the cloud, doing what clouds do. The mountain is simply the mountain, being what mountains are, both entirely themselves, both completely fine. The meadow is available right now, not after you have resolved the difficult thought, not after the anxiety has passed, not after you have finally become the kind of person who meditates correctly. Right now, in the middle of whatever the mind is doing, the watching is already here. The mountain has not gone anywhere. The meadow has always been this large. You were just looking at the sheep. Once the war eases, once the watching genuinely opens, something else becomes possible that fighting never allowed. The very things you were trying to expel, the thoughts that seemed most threatening, the loops that seemed most intractable, begin to reveal something unexpected about themselves. Not as enemies, not as evidence of failure, as something almost like nourishment, if you know what to do with them. Put your hands in soil sometime. Not for any particular reason, not as part of a system or a plan. Just kneel down somewhere where things grow and press your hands into the earth until you feel the temperature change, cooler beneath the surface, slightly damp, carrying a smell that is older than anything you own. There is something in that contact that the body recognizes before the mind has a chance to name it. Something grounding in the most literal sense of the word. Something that quietly communicates, without language, that this has all been happening for a very long time before you arrived and will continue for a very long time after you leave. Now look at what is growing. In any garden that has been left alone for even a short while, there are weeds. Not as a failure of the garden, as evidence that the soil is alive, that the conditions are fertile, that something in that earth wants to grow and will grow if given the slightest opportunity. The same soil that produces the weed produces the plant you actually intended. The same conditions that invite one invite the other. The richness is not selective. An experienced gardener does not despair at weeds. An experienced gardener pulls them, but does not throw them away. The pulled weed gets buried near the base of the plant, pressed back into the soil, close to the roots of what you are trying to grow. And there, in the dark, it breaks down, becomes matter, feeds the very plant it appeared to be competing with. The weed that looked like the problem becomes, underground, part of the solution. This is one of the most precise and quietly radical teachings in all of Zen Buddhism. And it is about your mind. You should be grateful for the weeds you have in your mind, because eventually they will enrich your practice. Read that again slowly. Not the weeds you will have once you have tidied yourself up. Not the manageable weeds of a mind that has already done significant work on itself. The weeds you have right now. The anxious loops. The self-critical voice that arrives without invitation and stays well past its welcome. The restlessness that makes stillness feel like a punishment. The old grievances that surface during meditation with the reliability of tides. The thoughts you are ashamed of having. The fears you have tried to logic away and failed. The patterns you have recognized in yourself for years and not yet managed to change. All of it, exactly as it is, right now. Nourishment. This requires a moment to sit with, because it contradicts almost everything we have been taught about how improvement works. The cultural story is straightforward. Identify what is wrong, remove what is wrong, replace it with something better. The broken thing is the obstacle. Progress means getting past it. Peace is what exists on the other side of the difficulty, once the difficulty has been successfully dealt with. The Zen teaching turns this completely around. The difficulty is not in the way of the practice. The difficulty is the practice. The weed is not blocking the growth of the plant. The weed, properly understood and properly used, is feeding it. Think about what actually happens when something genuinely difficult moves through the mind during sitting. Not the mild discomfort of a wandering thought, but the real difficulty, the kind that arrives with weight, that the body responds to, that makes you want to stand up and do something else immediately. What happens in the moment you do not stand up? In the moment you stay, despite the discomfort, and simply watch? Something is being asked of you that ordinary comfort never asks. A capacity is being exercised that does not develop in the absence of resistance. The muscle analogy is almost too obvious to use, and yet it is exactly right. No one develops strength without something to push against. The resistance is not incidental to the development. It is the mechanism of it. Remove the resistance entirely, and there is nothing to develop against. No condition under which the capacity can deepen. The weed in the mind is the resistance. Staying present with it, without fleeing and without fighting, is the work. And the work, over time, builds exactly the quality of awareness that every other approach was trying to achieve through tidying. Equanimity cannot be manufactured in pleasant conditions alone. Steadiness that only holds when things are easy is not steadiness, it is comfort. The two feel identical until the moment they are tested. Then the difference is immediate and unmistakable. This is why the gardener buries the weed near the plant. Not because the weed is secretly good all along, but because the material is there. It is real, and real material, used with understanding, nourishes rather than wastes. Nothing has to be imported. Nothing has to be invented. The difficult thought you are already having contains everything needed to deepen the awareness you are already developing. Return for a moment to the image of hands in soil. The smell of earth when it is turned, the slight resistance as fingers press through the surface, the temperature of it. When you pull a weed, there is a moment of effort, the grip, the pull, the feeling of the root releasing. Then the weed is in your hand. You look at it. It is not monstrous. It is just a plant that grew where you did not intend it to grow. Its roots were reaching for the same water and light that your intended plants are reaching for. It was doing nothing wrong. It was simply alive, responding to conditions, growing as living things grow. The difficult thought is the same. It arose because the conditions for it were present, not because you are broken, not because your practice is failing, not because you are less capable of peace than the person sitting calmly in the next room, or the monk on the other side of the world who seems to have resolved all of this already. The thought arose because you are alive, because you have a history, because something in your experience created the conditions for exactly this thought to grow in exactly this soil. That is all, and now it is in your hand, and you can bury it near the root of something you are trying to grow. What does that actually mean in practice? It means that when the anxious thought arrives during sitting, you do not treat its arrival as a sign that sitting is not working. You treat it as sitting, working. The weed is appearing because the soil is alive enough to produce it. The difficulty is surfacing because the conditions of stillness are real enough to allow it to surface. If you were truly absent from your own mind, distracted, numbed, unavailable, the difficult thought would not even register. The fact that it registers clearly, that it arrives with weight and specificity, is evidence of a quality of awareness that is functioning. Then, rather than moving against it or away from it, you bring it close. Not to analyze it or dramatize it or give it the extended residence it often demands. Simply to acknowledge it fully, to feel its weight without adding the additional weight of resistance, to press it into the soil near the root of the practice, near the simple, faithful act of remaining present, and let it break down there. It will break down. This is what difficult thoughts do when they are not fought and not fled. They lose the energy that resistance was giving them. They are experienced fully rather than partially, felt all the way through rather than pushed away before they complete their natural movement. And something that is experienced fully, without resistance, does not linger the way something half felt and half suppressed does. It passes. It enriches. The ground is richer for it. This does not mean the difficult thought will not return. Weeds return. The same conditions that produce the first one are still present. New ones grow in the same soil. A gardener does not conclude from this that gardening has failed. The gardener simply continues, pulling, burying, watching, tending, season after season, without expecting the weeds to stop, without measuring the quality of the garden by their absence, without treating each new growth as a referendum on the gardener's competence. The practice continues. The soil deepens. Slowly, over time, almost without noticing it, the quality of what grows there changes. Not because the weeds were finally eliminated, because the soil became rich enough that what you intended could take root more deeply, more firmly, with greater resilience against the seasons. There is a quality of effort in this that is different from the effort of control. Control is effortful in a tight way, held, braced, vigilant, always checking whether the thing it is controlling is still where it was put. This is effortful in an open way. It requires presence, but not tension. It requires returning, again and again, to the simple act of sitting with what is present. The effort is real, but it moves in a different direction from the effort of fighting. It moves toward the ground rather than away from it. And the ground responds. This is what every gardener who has worked the same soil over many seasons comes to understand, that the ground is not passive, not indifferent, not a neutral medium into which you deposit effort and retrieve results mechanically. The ground is alive. It responds to what is given to it. Feed it, and it deepens. Work it, and it opens. Return to it regularly, and it learns to receive what you bring, to process it, to give it back to you transformed. The mind is the same. Every difficult thought you have stayed with, rather than fled, has deepened something. Every anxious loop you have watched all the way through rather than fought has built a quality of steadiness that fighting never could have built. Every moment of restlessness you have simply sat inside, without demanding it resolve itself into peace on your schedule, has added something invisible and real to the soil of the practice. The weeds were not obstacles. They were never obstacles. They were the garden doing exactly what a living, fertile garden does, producing everything the conditions allow, without preference, without hierarchy, without any way of knowing in advance what will be useful and what will not. The gardener makes that distinction. The gardener decides what to tend and what to bury near the root. And the gardener, over time, becomes the kind of person the garden makes: patient, attentive, intimate with the rhythms of growth, no longer surprised by difficulty, no longer defeated by a season that produces more weeds than flowers. Because the flowers are coming. The soil is being enriched by everything you have been bringing to it, even the things you brought believing they were signs of failure, especially those. All of this, the fighting, the resisting, the failed attempts at stillness, the restless nights, the meditation sessions that felt like they went nowhere, none of it was wasted. It was the practice. All of it, the whole difficult accumulation of it, was the practice. And now there is a question worth sitting with. If difficulty is not a sign of failure, if struggle is not evidence that you are doing something wrong, then what does it say about the one who struggles most? The one for whom sitting is hardest, for whom peace feels furthest away, for whom every session surfaces something new and uncomfortable. It says something quite different from what they have probably concluded about themselves. There is an old teaching about 4 horses, not a metaphor dressed up to look like a story, an actual teaching, plain and direct, used for centuries to describe something true about the nature of practice and the nature of human beings. It goes like this. The first horse is the finest horse imaginable. Show it the shadow of the whip, and it runs. Not the whip itself, the shadow, a suggestion of movement, a shift in the light, and the horse responds immediately, completely, without hesitation. The rider barely needs to exist. The communication between intention and action is so refined, so immediate, that it barely qualifies as communication at all. The second horse runs when the whip comes close to the skin, not touching, close. The anticipation of contact is enough. A good horse, a responsive horse, not the finest but close. The third horse runs when the whip makes contact with the body. Feeling is required before movement begins. The sensitivity of the first 2 horses is not present here, but the horse runs. The instruction gets through. Something is working, even if it works more slowly than one might wish. The fourth horse runs only when the pain reaches the marrow of the bones, not the skin, not the surface of the body, the marrow, the deepest interior of the animal, the place where the bones are made, where the blood begins. Only there, only when the difficulty has penetrated that far, does the fourth horse move. Now, which horse do you want to be? The answer seems obvious. Almost everyone who hears this teaching immediately wants to be the first horse. Failing that, the second. Failing that, at least the third. The fourth horse is the worst horse, the least responsive, the most resistant, the most difficult to work with. If the teaching is about spiritual practice, then the first horse is the natural practitioner, the one for whom everything comes easily, the one who responds to the subtlest instruction without needing to be pushed. The fourth horse is the struggling practitioner, the one who needs to be hit repeatedly before anything shifts, the one for whom peace feels furthest away, stillness feels most foreign, practice feels most effortful. This is where the teaching makes its turn. The question is not which horse you want to be. The question is what you do with the horse you are. And here, quietly, is the inversion that changes the whole picture. When you consider the mercy of Buddha, when you sit with what genuine compassion actually feels like, rather than what the word implies, where does it rest most fully? On the first horse, for whom everything comes easily, or on the fourth horse, for whom every single step costs something real? The fourth horse reaches the marrow. That is not a description of failure. That is a description of depth. The first horse is touched at the surface and responds. The fourth horse is touched all the way to the bone. The difficulty does not stay on the skin. It goes in. And what goes in that far leaves something behind that surface contact never reaches. Think about what you actually know from your hardest experiences. Not the convenient difficulties, the ones that were uncomfortable for a week and then resolved into a tidy lesson. The genuine ones, the losses that change the shape of things permanently, the failures that sent the pain all the way to the marrow. What do you know now that you did not know before those experiences? And could you have learnt it any other way? Through reading, through instruction, through observing the difficulties of other people from a comfortable distance. The marrow knows things the surface does not. The fourth horse, by the nature of what it requires to move, develops a relationship with difficulty that the first horse never needs to develop and therefore never has. Those who sit perfectly still from the beginning, for whom the posture is natural and the mind quiets easily and the practice settles without significant effort, these are not the ones who typically find what the practice is pointing at most deeply. They find something. They find the pleasant aspects of stillness, the relief of quiet, the satisfaction of a practice that feels as though it is working. But the ones who struggle, the ones for whom sitting is genuinely hard, for whom the mind refuses to cooperate, for whom every session is an exercise in staying despite wanting to leave, these ones, when they find it in a way that cannot be taken away. Because they had to go all the way to the marrow to get there. Imperfection is not a disqualification from the practice. It is the entry point. The struggling is not what you have to get through before the real practice begins. The struggling is the practice. The horse that needs to go to the marrow is not the worst practitioner, it is the most thorough one. There is a Japanese phrase that enters here. Dogen, the 13th century teacher, whose words run beneath so much of this tradition, used it to describe something that most people would consider a confession of failure. Shosaku, Jushaku, one continuous mistake. Not one mistake, followed by correction, followed by progress. Not a series of mistakes moving toward eventual competence. One continuous mistake. The whole of practice understood as an unbroken succession of imperfect efforts, each one arising from the last, none of them final, none of them the moment at which you have finally gotten it right. And Dogen said this was the ground of Zen. Not the obstacle, the ground. A student once wrote to a teacher, embarrassed, explaining that he had been given a calendar of good intentions at the start of the year, small practices, small reminders, and that the year had barely begun before he had already failed to follow them, already broken the small promises, already fallen short of his own intentions in the first weeks. He wrote as someone confessing inadequacy. He wrote expecting comfort at best, instruction at worst. What he received was something neither of those. One continuous mistake, the teacher replied. This is Zen. Not because failure does not matter, not because effort is irrelevant, but because the self that insists it should have gotten this right by now, the self that treats imperfection as evidence that something is fundamentally broken, that self is the actual obstacle, not the mistake, the verdict on the mistake, the story of inadequacy built on top of it. The decision that falling short of intention means the horse is too badly trained ever to run. The horse runs, imperfectly, with effort, reaching the marrow before it moves. But it runs, and the running is the practice, not the running of the first horse, clean and immediate and almost effortless. The running of the fourth horse, hard won, slow to start, costing something real every single time, still running. A good father, in Zen teaching, is not a good father. This sounds like a riddle, and it is, but only until it opens. The one who thinks he is a good father is not a good father, because the certainty itself has closed something. The evaluation has settled. The learning has stopped. But the one who thinks he may be failing, who is always reaching towards something he has not quite achieved, who measures each day against the father he is trying to be rather than the father he has decided he has become, that one, in the trying itself, in the continuous imperfect effort, is the good father. The practice is the same. The meditator who sits each morning certain they are doing it correctly has, in that certainty, found a resting place that is not the practice. The meditator who sits each morning uncertain, struggling, wondering if this is working, staying anyway, that one is inside the practice, all the way inside it, where it actually is. One continuous mistake. not as a consolation for failure, as a precise description of what genuine practice looks like from the inside. Consider what it would mean to actually accept this, not as a concept, but as a genuine orientation to approach each sitting, each day, each attempt at presence, with the understanding that the imperfection is not something to eliminate before the real work begins. That the real work is already happening inside the imperfection, because of the imperfection. The weed is being buried near the root. The marrow is being reached. The fourth horse is running. What would you stop waiting for? How many people are waiting to begin their practice until they have more time, more quiet, a better cushion, a calmer mind, a life that has settled into something more conducive to stillness? How many have concluded, somewhere in the accumulation of imperfect attempts, that they are simply not the kind of person for whom this works? That the first horse is what is required, and they are, irrevocably, the fourth. The teaching says, you are exactly the right kind of difficult. Your particular resistance, your specific struggle, the precise shape of your restlessness, these are not evidence against your capacity for peace. They are the conditions under which your capacity for peace will be built. Not despite the difficulty, through it, all the way through it, marrow and all. Calligraphy teachers in Japan have noted for centuries that the students who come to the art without natural talent, the ones for whom the brush feels wrong, the ink too thick or too thin, the strokes awkward where they should be fluid, these students, when they persist, often become the finest calligraphers. Not always, but often enough that the observation has held across generations. Because the naturally gifted student reaches a certain level easily and then stops there, comfortable, without the necessity of going further. The struggling student never stops being pushed by the work. The marrow keeps being reached. The depth keeps being built. This is true in art. It is true in life. And it is true in this practice. So if you have come to this with a mind that will not cooperate, with a history of abandoned attempts, with a self-assessment that places you firmly among the worst horses, the teaching is not asking you to become a better horse. It is asking you to be this horse completely, to run from the marrow the way this horse runs, to bring the full weight of your particular difficulty into the practice, not as something to overcome, but as the very thing that makes the practice yours. One continuous mistake, sustained, single-minded, unhurried effort in the direction of something that may never be perfectly achieved. This is not a lowered standard. It is the actual standard, the one that applies to the first horse and the fourth horse equally, because the first horse's ease and the fourth horse's struggle are both, in the end, just conditions. What matters is the running. What matters is the staying. What matters is that the horse, whatever horse it is, keeps moving in the direction it has chosen, imperfectly, faithfully, all the way to the marrow. There was a man who understood this, not as a teaching, but as a daily physical fact. not someone who read about one continuous mistake and found it consoling. Someone who lived it, returned to it, and let it leave a mark on his body that he carried for the rest of his life. What that mark was, and what it cost him to earn it, is where we are going next. There is a detail in an old account of a Zen teacher that stops you if you are paying attention. Not the teaching, the detail. The teacher had a callus on his forehead. Not a metaphorical mark, not a quality of character visible only to those with the eyes to see it. An actual physical callus, thickened skin built up over decades in the exact spot where his forehead met the floor during bowing. The body had recorded what the years contained, pressed into the flesh, permanent, carried everywhere, the accumulated evidence of a man who had bowed so many times that his forehead had changed shape to accommodate it. Think about what that requires. Not in terms of devotion or discipline. Those words are too abstract for what is actually being described. Think about it in terms of repetition. Skin does not thicken from occasional contact. Skin thickens from contact sustained over years, returned to so reliably that the body eventually decides this surface, this pressure, this particular meeting of forehead and floor is a permanent enough feature of existence to be built into the architecture of the body itself. The callus is a record, and what it records is not perfection. This teacher joined the Soto order at 32. For a Japanese priest, this is late. The path typically begins much younger, when the joints are more flexible, when the habits of the self are less established, when the personality has not yet had 3 decades to settle into its particular shape. His master saw this immediately and did not soften the observation. He called the new student a late-jointed fellow, said it plainly, without cruelty, but without cushioning either. You have come late. Your joints are stiff. This will be harder for you than it needed to be. And it was. This teacher was stubborn by his own description. He knew it about himself, did not pretend otherwise. The stubbornness that makes late entry difficult is the same stubbornness that makes certain kinds of change feel almost impossible. The habits of thought, the grooves worn into personality over years, the defended positions that a person old enough to have experienced real loss has real reasons to maintain. Giving all of that up, bowing it down to the floor, pressing the forehead into the mat, and surrendering the accumulated sense of self that 3 decades of living had constructed, this was not easy for him. The master knew it was not easy, and the master, in the way that genuine teachers have always responded to genuine difficulty, did not make it easier. He scolded, regularly, directly. The scolding had a quality that those who witnessed it described with something close to tenderness, because underneath the scolding, always, was the master's recognition that the stubborn fellow bowing at his feet was worth the difficulty. That the stubbornness itself, properly met, was not a flaw to be eliminated, but a quality to be transformed. The tiger, trained, does not stop being a tiger. It simply learns what the tiger's strength is actually for. So he bowed, not because it came easily, not because he had resolved the stubbornness first and then begun the practice once the resolution was complete. He bowed while still stubborn. He bowed as the fourth horse, reaching the marrow every time. He bowed because inside himself, always, he heard the master's scolding voice, and the hearing of it was precisely what moved him back to the floor, morning after morning, year after year. The callus grew. The forehead changed. The body built its record. When this teacher was 70 years old, he said something that contains an entire life. He said, "When I was young, I was like a tiger. Now I am like a cat." He said this with pleasure, not resignation, not the rueful acknowledgement of a man reflecting on what time had taken from him. Pleasure, the genuine satisfaction of a person who had made the journey from tiger to cat and found that the cat was the better place to arrive. The tiger is magnificent, powerful, certain, forceful, capable of imposing its will on its surroundings. The cat is something else entirely. The cat is present, unhurried, quietly alert without tension, at ease in its own body, in a way that power never quite manages to be, because power is always slightly vigilant, always aware of what would happen if it were not there. The cat does not need to be a tiger to feel safe. The cat simply is. This is what decades of bowing had accomplished. Not the elimination of the man's character, the stubbornness, the late-jointed difficulty, the tiger that had needed real training, the transformation of it, the tiger learning, through 10,000 surrenders, that what it had been protecting with such force was not the precious thing it had assumed, and that the letting go of it, the pressing of the forehead to the floor, the giving up of the defended self, the small daily dying that bowing asks for, was not loss. It was arrival. Bowing in this tradition is not a gesture of submission to something outside the self. This is a misunderstanding that the surface of the practice makes easy to make. You bow to the Buddha. Surely that is submission. Surely that is the acknowledgement of something greater than yourself to which you defer. But the teaching underneath is more precise and stranger than that. When you bow to Buddha, you should have no idea of Buddha. You simply become one with Buddha. You are already Buddha. And the bowing is the act of recognizing this, not before something outside you, but into something that you and what you are bowing to share completely. Buddha bows to Buddha. The self bows to the self, not the defended, accumulated, late-jointed self with its stubbornness and its grooves and its decades of constructed habit. The original self, the one that was there before the construction began. This is what the forehead meets the floor in search of, morning after morning. Not an external authority, not a reward for sufficient humility. The contact between what has been built up and what was always already there beneath the building. And yet there is something in the practice that is genuinely paradoxical, that requires sitting with rather than solving. There are 4 vows that sit at the heart of this tradition. They are recited. They are returned to. They function less like goals and more like orientations, directions, rather than destinations, pointing towards something the reciter knows cannot be finally reached and continues toward anyway. Although sentient beings are innumerable, we vow to save them. Although our desires are endless, we vow to be free of them. Although the teachings are limitless, we vow to learn them all. Although enlightenment is unattainable, we vow to attain it. Stay with that last one. Although enlightenment is unattainable, we vow to attain it. Not despite the impossibility, with full knowledge of it. The vow does not pretend the goal is reachable if you try hard enough. It acknowledges directly that it is not reachable and makes the vow anyway. Because the making of the vow is not about the destination. The making of the vow is the practice itself. The direction itself is the point. The aspiration itself, held sincerely and returned to continuously, is what the whole enterprise rests on. This is not a consolation for failure. It is a precise description of what genuine commitment looks like when it has stopped needing its own completion to justify its existence. A man who thinks he is a good father is not a good father, because the thought of already being good has created a resting place, a point of arrival, a closed door. But a man who is always reaching toward being a good father, who measures each day against the father he is trying to become, who never arrives at the comfortable conclusion that the work is done, that man, in the continuous imperfect reaching, is practicing fatherhood in the only way it actually works. The vow to attain the unattainable keeps the door open in the same way. It removes the possibility of arrival, and in doing so, removes the complacency that arrival always brings. There is nowhere to stop and say, I have done it. There is only the continuing, the next bow, the next morning, the next pressing of the forehead to the floor, not because yesterday's pressing was insufficient, but because the practice is alive, and living things do not stop. The callus on that forehead is the physical evidence of a man who had truly understood this, who had taken the vow seriously enough to return to it not when he felt spiritually prepared, not when the conditions were right, not when the stubbornness had finally been resolved, but every morning, regardless, as the 4th horse, reaching the marrow every time. There is a particular tenderness that this kind of commitment produces in those who witness it. Not admiration exactly. Admiration is what you feel for the first horse, for the one who makes it look easy, for the natural practitioner whose stillness arrives without visible effort. This is something quieter than admiration, closer to recognition. The recognition of someone who has taken the full weight of their own imperfection and bowed with it day after day, until the imperfection and the practice became the same thing. The tiger had arrived at 70 as a cat, not a diminished tiger, not a tiger that had given up. A tiger that had bowed so many times it had found something on the floor worth becoming, something quieter than power, something more present than certainty, something that did not need to impose itself, because it was no longer at war with what it was. The pleasure in his voice when he said it was not the pleasure of relief. It was the pleasure of a man at home in his own life, completely, undefendedly, without the performance of certainty that the tiger years had required. The cat simply sits. The cat does not need to prove the sitting is correct. The cat does not compare its sitting to other cats or wonder whether it has been sitting long enough or in the right way. The cat sits because it is a cat, and this is what it is, and there is nowhere else to be, and nothing else required. This is what 10,000 surrenders leave behind. Not the absence of the self that was surrendered, not a vacancy where a person used to be, a presence that has stopped needing to announce itself, a forehead marked by its own history, a man who found, somewhere in the decades of pressing his stubbornness to the floor, that the floor had something to offer that the standing position had never revealed. You do not need a callus to understand this. You do not need to begin bowing tomorrow, or to take up any formal practice that does not fit the shape of your life. What the story is pointing at is not the specific act of bowing. It is the quality of return, the willingness to come back imperfectly, continuously, to whatever practice you have chosen, without requiring it to have produced sufficient results before you give it the next morning. One continuous mistake, one forehead, one floor, one vow made and remade each morning, not because yesterday's keeping of it was insufficient, but because the making of it is itself the practice, and the practice does not stop. The tiger does not need to decide to become a cat. It simply needs to bow, consistently, imperfectly, all the way to the marrow, year after year, and the cat will arrive on its own, in its own time, with its own quiet pleasure in simply being what it has, through 10,000 surrenders, learned to be. Total commitment does not always look like dramatic sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like a callus. Sometimes it looks like an old man pleased to be a cat. Sometimes it looks like one more morning, one more bow, one more vow made to something unattainable, because the making of the vow is the only honest response to the size of what is being attempted. There is another kind of total commitment that the tradition describes, less intimate than bowing, less personal than a callus, but no less complete. It is not a single repeated act. It is a way of moving through the whole of life without deviation, a direction so consistent that even the most disorienting circumstances cannot pull it off course. What that direction looks like and what keeps it from ever becoming rigid is a question two old friends answered without using a single word of explanation. Two friends are finishing a conversation. They have been talking for some time. the kind of talk that serious practitioners have with each other, where the subject is not small and the words are chosen carefully, and both people are genuinely trying to say something true rather than simply filling the air between them. The subject has been the Bodhisattva's way, the single-minded path, what it actually means to live without deviation from one's deepest intention, not occasionally, not when conditions are favorable, but as the consistent ground of an entire life. They are Zen masters, these two friends, Chokei and Hofuku, Tang Dynasty China, two men who have given their lives to this question and found in each other someone capable of genuinely engaging with it. Chokei has just made a careful observation about the Bodhisattva's way, something considered, something worth saying. He is waiting to hear what his friend thinks. Hofuku is quiet for a moment. Then he says, "We have had enough discussion. Let us have a cup of tea." That is the whole story. No dramatic reversal, no sudden awakening, no cryptic utterance requiring decades of contemplation to unpack. Just two friends, a conversation that has run its natural course, and an invitation to tea. And yet this small exchange has been preserved and returned to for more than 1,000 years. Not because it is mysterious, because it is perfectly clear. What Hofuku understood and what the cup of tea demonstrated without a word of explanation is that the Bodhisattva's way is not found at the end of the conversation about it. It is not the conclusion you arrive at after sufficient discussion, the principle you finally articulate clearly enough that it can be held and carried forward as a possession. The way is the cup of tea. The way is the walking to the kettle, the waiting for the water, the sitting together in the particular quality of quiet that follows a good conversation. It is this moment, approached with sincerity, completely, and then the next moment approached the same way, and then the next. There is a teaching in this tradition that sounds, on the surface, almost reckless in its confidence. Even if the sun were to rise from the west, the Bodhisattva has only one way. Let that settle for a moment before examining it. Even if the fundamental order of things were reversed, even if the most reliable and constant feature of the physical world suddenly contradicted everything experience has established, the Bodhisattva's direction does not change. Not because she is inflexible or unable to respond to new information, but because the way she is moving toward is not dependent on external conditions remaining stable. The sun rising from a different direction would change many things. It would not change the direction of sincerity. Sincerity itself is the railway track. Picture a long railway line, not a short journey between two known stations, a line that extends in both directions beyond what the eye can follow, beginning somewhere you cannot see and ending somewhere equally invisible. You are on a train moving along this line. Through the window, everything changes. The landscape shifts from city to countryside, to coast, to mountain, to plain. The weather changes. The light changes. The passengers around you come and go. What was outside the window an hour ago bears no resemblance to what is outside it now, and what will be there in another hour is entirely unknown. The track does not change. Beneath all of that movement and variety and unpredictability, the same track, the same gauge, the same spacing, the same relationship between one rail and the other, mile after mile after mile. The train does not need to decide, at each new stretch of landscape, whether this particular section of track is worth staying on. It does not evaluate the current scenery against previous scenery and determine whether continuing in this direction still makes sense. It moves along the track because the track is there, and the track is there because it was laid with intention and has been maintained with care, not because each individual section has been found beautiful or interesting, but because the track itself is the point. Sincerity is the track, not the scenery, not the destination, not the particular emotional weather of any given sitting or any given day. The track itself, the consistent, daily, unremarkable, return to what matters, regardless of what the view outside the window happens to be offering. This teaching has a companion that arrives quietly, dressed as an observation about cooking. How does dough become bread? Not as a metaphor, as a genuine inquiry into the nature of transformation. What is happening, specifically, in the interval between the raw material and the finished thing? What does the baker need to understand, not just about technique, but about the nature of sustained application? The answer is always the same. You put the dough in the oven and you watch it carefully. You do this again. You do this again. Not because each repetition is different from the last in some exciting or revelatory way, because the repetition is how the understanding deepens. Because the baker who has made the same bread 500 times knows something the baker who has made it twice cannot know. Not because the recipe changed between attempt 2 and attempt 500, but because the body has learned what the mind alone cannot teach. There is a particular kind of boredom that arrives in any sustained practice. It comes reliably, usually somewhere after the initial enthusiasm has settled and before the deeper engagement has fully established itself. The practice feels repetitive because it is repetitive. The track looks the same as yesterday's track because it is the same track. The dough is the same dough. The sitting is the same sitting. And the mind, habituated to novelty as the signal of significance, concludes from this sameness that something may have gone wrong. Nothing has gone wrong. The sameness is the point. The repetition is not the obstacle between you and the real practice. The repetition is the practice. The track does not become a different track in order to be interesting. It continues faithfully, the same track, and the faithfulness itself is what makes it trustworthy. A track that changed direction based on the current emotional weather of the traveler would not be a track at all. It would be a wandering, which is precisely what the railway is designed to transcend. Hofuku knew this. When he ended the conversation with an invitation to tea, he was not dismissing what had been said. He was demonstrating what he and Choke had been discussing. The Bodhisattva's way is not a conclusion you reach through sufficient argument. It is a movement you make, continuously, in the direction of what is actually present. The conversation was present, and they were in it fully. The conversation ended, and the tea was present, and they moved to that fully. No residue from one carried unnecessarily into the other. No clinging to the discussion once the discussion was complete. The track continues. The scenery changes. The train keeps moving. This is also, quietly, a teaching about talk. There is a danger in discussing the Bodhisattva's way that Hofuku was alert to, the danger of mistaking the conversation for the thing the conversation is about, of spending so long examining the track that you forget you are supposed to be on the train, of developing such a sophisticated understanding of the nature of the journey that the journey itself never quite begins. The cup of tea is always the answer to this. Not literally tea, though tea, approached with full attention, is as complete a practice as any formal sitting, but the movement from discussion to action, from analysis to engagement, from the description of the track to the feeling of it moving beneath the train. The railway track is always the same, and if it were to become wider or narrower, it would be disastrous. Wider or narrower, not broken, not missing, just slightly different from what it is supposed to be. And this small deviation, this accommodation to the particular conditions of the moment, this slight adjustment based on how things feel today, rather than what the track requires, would derail the whole thing. There is a kind of sincerity that bends, that is sincere on good days, and sincere when the practice feels alive, and sincere when the results seem visible. And there is a kind of sincerity that does not bend, that keeps the same width on the days when it costs something as on the days when it flows easily. That maintains its gauge consistently, not because the conditions demand it, but because consistency is the only form in which the track can do what a track is for. The Bodhisattva's way is the second kind. Not rigid. Rigidity is about the surface, the manner, the outer form. The track can pass through any landscape. It can curve, it can climb, it can descend into valleys and cross bridges over rivers. What it cannot do is change its own essential nature in response to the difficulty of the terrain. The terrain changes, the track does not. This distinction is the difference between genuine practice and the performance of practice. Genuine practice looks the same on the morning when everything feels right as on the morning when nothing does. Not because the practitioner is unaffected by the difference, but because the practice has stopped being contingent on the feeling. The dough goes in the oven. Again, the forehead meets the floor. Again, the tea is made. Again, the track extends forward, the same track, into whatever landscape the next mile contains. There is something that settles in the body when this is genuinely understood. not the excitement of a new insight. Excitement is the enemy of the railway track, because excitement implies that something unusual is happening, and the track is specifically the practice of making the unusual into the ordinary. It is closer to the feeling of finding the ground beneath your feet after a period of uncertainty. Not dramatic, not announced. Just the quiet recognition that there is something to stand on, that it is the same thing that was there yesterday and will be there tomorrow, and that its reliability is not a limitation, but the most generous thing it could offer. The sights from the train will always change. This is not a problem. This is the nature of being alive, moving through a world that does not hold still, encountering weather and loss, and unexpected grace in no particular order and without prior arrangement. The practice is not the attempt to make the landscape predictable. The practice is the maintenance of the track beneath it. Sincerity, the same width, the same gauge, across every kind of terrain that life produces. Hofuku and Chokei drank their tea. The conversation was over, and the tea was the next thing, and they were in it completely, the way they had been in the conversation. The track continuing, the scenery changed, the train still moving. This, precisely this, exactly this simple, is the Bodhisattva's way. Not a grand gesture, not a dramatic renunciation, not an achievement requiring years of preparation before it can begin. The next thing, done completely, with the full weight of a sincerity that does not widen or narrow based on how it feels today. A direction, not a destination. A track, not a map. A train that is always already moving, always already on the only track there is, needing only for the passenger to stop looking for a different one and feel the one that has been beneath them all along. And what becomes possible, once the track is trusted, is something that the searching mind could never quite manage. Action that is complete, action that begins fully and ends fully and leaves nothing trailing behind it, no residue of self-consciousness, no shadow of the moment before, no smoke from the fire. Just the action itself, clean and entire, the way Hofuku's cup of tea was clean and entire, and then simply done. In 16th century Japan, there was a man who understood something about presence that most people spend their entire lives circling without ever landing on. His name was Sen no Rikyu. He was not a monk. He was not a philosopher in the formal sense. He was a master of the tea ceremony, which is to say, he was a man who had given his life to the practice of doing one ordinary thing with such complete attention that the ordinary thing became, in his hands, a transmission of something much larger than itself. A bowl of tea, water heated to the right temperature, a bamboo whisk moving through green powder in a particular rhythm, a ceramic cup held with both hands, received with a slight bow, drunk in a specific number of sips. These are the external facts of the tea ceremony. they tell you almost nothing about what Rikyu was actually doing. What Rikyu was doing in every ceremony he conducted across a lifetime of ceremonies was this: he was burning completely, entering the room with nothing held in reserve, pouring the water with no part of himself elsewhere, presenting the bowl with hands that had no agenda beyond the presenting. And when the ceremony ended, leaving nothing behind, no performance to review, no impression to manage, no residue of self-consciousness trailing after him, like smoke from a fire that did not burn cleanly. Each ceremony was complete in itself. Each one began fully and ended fully. Nothing carried unnecessarily from the one before. Nothing withheld for the one after. Just this bowl, this water, this moment, this person receiving the tea, and then, when it was done, the simple fact of its being done. This is the teaching on no trace, and it is one of the most practically useful teachings in the entire Zen tradition. Useful not in the way that techniques are useful, but in the way that a window is useful when the room has been airless for too long. Consider what the alternative looks like. Not dramatically, not the extreme version where a person becomes so weighted by their own history that they can barely function. The ordinary version, the version that most people live inside without quite noticing it. You do something, a conversation, a piece of work, a decision, an interaction with another person. The thing ends, and then you carry it. You replay the conversation and find the moment where you could have said something better. You review the work and locate the flaw you wish you had caught earlier. You reconstruct the interaction in a slightly improved version where you were more articulate, more generous, more composed. You carry the whole thing forward into the next moment, and the moment after that, like a fire that has not burned cleanly, still producing heat, but also producing smoke, still consuming fuel, but leaving residue rather than ash. The Zen teaching says, when you do something, burn yourself completely. Like a good bonfire, leave no trace. Not as a prescription for forgetting, not as an instruction to become careless about the past or indifferent to the quality of what you do. The bonfire does not fail to burn. It burns completely, which is precisely the point. Total combustion leaves only ash, clean, neutral, finished. Not smoke, ash. The smoke is what remains when the burning is incomplete, when something is held back from the flame, when part of the fuel resists combustion and instead smolders. The held back part is always the self. The watching self, the self that stands slightly apart from the action and monitors how the action is going, how it is being received, how it will be remembered. This watching produces the smoke, not the action itself, the watching of the action while the action is happening. The doubling of attention between the thing being done and the observer doing the recording. Rikyu understood this in his hands before he understood it anywhere else. The tea ceremony does not permit the watching self to remain in charge. not because the practitioner suppresses it. Suppression is just another form of attention, another smoke-producing activity, but because the demands of the ceremony, practiced with genuine sincerity over enough time, gradually make the watching self unnecessary. The hands know what to do. The body knows the rhythm. The attention that used to be split between the doing and the watching of the doing slowly consolidates into just the doing. And when that happens, when the action and the attention become one thing rather than two, the action itself changes quality. It becomes, as the Zen tradition describes it, straightforward, direct, not in the sense of being blunt or simplified, but in the literal sense of moving straight from intention to expression without the detour through self-consciousness. This is what people mean when they describe a master at work. Not the master who performs mastery, who is visibly aware of being watched and adjusts accordingly. The master who is simply inside the work, completely, with no division between the person and the action. What you witness in those moments is not technique, though technique is certainly present. What you witness is the absence of smoke, the clean burn, the action leaving nothing behind it except itself. Rikyu conducted his tea ceremonies this way for decades. Each bowl of tea complete, each ceremony its own whole world, entered fully and left fully, the door closed behind it, without residue or review. In 1591, the ruler of Japan, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, ordered Rikyu to commit ritual suicide. The political circumstances were complex, and the reasons have been disputed for 4 centuries. What matters here is not the politics. What matters is what Rikyu said in the moments before his death. He said, "When I have this sword, there is no Buddha and no patriarch." Sit with that for a moment. No Buddha, no patriarch. The entire architecture of the tradition to which he had devoted his life, the lineage of teachers, the accumulated wisdom, the framework of practice, none of it separate from this moment, this sword, this final and complete act. Not because the Buddha did not exist, not because the teaching had no value, but because in the moment of complete action, there is no gap between the actor and the act, between the teaching and the living of it, between the practitioner and what the practitioner has spent a lifetime practicing. The sword was not a symbol of the end of his practice. It was the practice, expressed one final time, with the same completeness that every bowl of tea had been expressed before it. This sounds extreme. It is extreme, but what it is pointing at is not extreme at all. It is the quality that every moment of genuine action contains, if approached with sufficient sincerity. The quality of being entirely here, with no division between the person and the present moment, with no smoke rising from the gap between what is being done and the self watching it being done. The tea ceremony was Rikyu's daily practice of this. Not the sword, the tea, one bowl at a time, one ceremony at a time, each one a small burning, complete, and clean, leaving only ash. The final act was not different from those ceremonies in its essential nature, only in its finality. Now bring this closer to daily life, because this teaching, while it arrives through a dramatic story, applies to the smallest possible scale of action. Think about what happens when you wash a dish with your full attention, not as a meditation exercise with a label on it, simply washing the dish, feeling the temperature of the water, the weight of the bowl in the hand, the specific resistance of the surface under the cloth. Present entirely to the dish, with no part of the mind in the conversation from earlier or the task waiting afterward. When the dish is clean, you put it down. That is finished. The next thing begins fresh, without the dish trailing after it. This is the small version of what Rikyu practiced. This is the no-trace teaching at the scale of an ordinary afternoon. Contrast it with the other way of washing the dish, which most people will recognize immediately. Hands in the water, mind in 5 other places. The dish gets washed. The outcome is achieved, but the attention was divided, and divided attention leaves a particular kind of residue. Not guilt, not regret necessarily, just the faint unsatisfyingness of a thing half done, the sense that you were present for the outcome, but absent from the experience, the smoke of incomplete combustion, drifting into the next moment and the next. Over time, this accumulates, not dramatically, but steadily. A day of divided attention is a day of smoke, and smoke, even in small quantities, obscures. The view through it is less clear. The air in it is less clean. And the personality that develops inside a life of divided attention develops, slowly and without noticing, a particular kind of weight. The weight of everything that was done but not fully inhabited, the accumulated residue of 1,000 half-presences, the smoke of 10,000 fires that did not burn cleanly. The teaching on no trace is the teaching on how to put that weight down, not by reviewing and resolving the accumulated past. That is more smoke, more division, more self-watching self, but by changing the nature of how the next action is entered. This action, this one, now, completely, without the watching self maintaining its separate position, without the division between the person and the present moment. One action at a time, clean, complete, leaving only ash. The ash is not nothing. This is an important distinction. The bonfire that burns completely does not disappear. It leaves ash, which is the clean residue of total combustion. What you do completely, with full presence and no watching self, dividing the attention, leaves something real behind. Not the smoke of self-consciousness, not the residue of incomplete presence, but the simple fact of having been genuinely there, which settles into the ground of experience cleanly, without complication, without the need for review or revision. You remember what you were actually present for. the conversations you were fully inside, the work you gave yourself to completely, the moments of genuine contact with another person that were not divided by the watching self, monitoring how the contact was going. These settle differently from the half-presences. They are ash rather than smoke, clean, finished, real. Dogen, the 13th century teacher, said it this way: ashes do not come back to firewood. Ash is ash. Firewood is firewood. Each exists completely in its own moment. The firewood does not mourn becoming ash. The ash does not wish to return to firewood. Each is entirely what it is, in the moment it is, without the confusion of wanting to be something other than what the present moment has made it. This is what Rikyu's life demonstrated, bowl by bowl, ceremony by ceremony, across 4 decades of practice. And what it demonstrates is not a distant ideal requiring extraordinary circumstances to approach. It is available in the next thing you do, if you do it completely. The next conversation, the next meal, the next ordinary task that the day presents. Enter it fully, burn without reservation, leave no smoke. And when it is finished, put it down. Not because it did not matter, because it did matter, completely, in the moment it was happening, and that completeness is exactly what allows it to be set down cleanly now. The fire burned. The ash is on the ground. There is nothing left to carry. Nothing left behind means nothing dragging forward. And nothing dragging forward means the next moment arrives clean, unobscured by the smoke of the last one, open to whatever it contains, ready to be entered with the same completeness that the previous moment deserved and received. This is the spaciousness that complete action creates. Not emptiness, in the bleak sense. Room. The specific, tangible room that opens when the accumulated weight of half-presences is no longer being carried. The air clears. The view extends further than it did through the smoke. And what can be seen from here, clearly, without obstruction, is something that divided attention could never quite bring into focus. Everything changes. Everything is always already changing. Nothing holds its form. Not the fire, not the wood, not the ceremony, not the man who conducts it, not the bowl he holds, not the water cooling inside it. Everything is already moving toward ash. Everything is already becoming what comes next. And in that constant movement, that ceaseless transformation from one form into another, there is something that the clean fire reveals and the smoky fire obscures. Something about the nature of existence itself that becomes visible only when the trace of self has been burned away completely. Stand at the base of a waterfall sometime and look up. Not a small waterfall, the kind that could be stepped across, the kind that fits inside a single glance. A large one, the kind whose top is so far above you that the water, falling from that height, does not appear to fall quickly at all. From a distance, it looks like a curtain, pale, slow-moving, almost still, as if the water were being lowered gently rather than falling freely. The distance compresses the speed into something that looks like patience, and the water comes down separated. What left the top as one continuous river arrives at the bottom as thousands of individual drops, broken apart by wind and air, and the sheer distance of the fall, each drop tracing its own trajectory, each one briefly, completely, its own distinct thing. There is a monastery in Japan called Eiheiji. It sits in a forest in Fukui Prefecture, surrounded by cedar trees so tall and so old that the light reaching the ground has already passed through several centuries of canopy. The monastery was founded in the 13th century by Dogen, the same teacher whose words have run beneath so much of this journey, the same man who said ashes do not return to firewood, the same man who called one continuous mistake the ground of Zen. There is a small bridge at Eiheiji. It crosses a stream near the entrance to the monastery grounds. Visitors pass over it without necessarily knowing its name or its story. But the name is worth knowing. It is called Hankakukyo, the Half-Dipper Bridge. The name comes from Dogen's practice when he drew water from the river. He would lower the dipper into the current, fill it, and use what he needed. But he never used the whole dipper. Whatever water remained after he had taken what was necessary, he returned to the river. Not because water was scarce, not from any principle of conservation or economy, but because he felt himself to be in relationship with the water, not as a user of a resource, but as one part of the river temporarily holding another part of the river and recognizing that the held part had somewhere it belonged. The water in the dipper had come from the river. The water in the dipper was still the river, briefly contained, and when the task was done, it went back. Not discarded, returned. There is a difference that matters enormously between those two words and what they carry. This practice was not performance. It was not a demonstration of spiritual sensitivity for the benefit of students watching. It was the natural expression of a man who had genuinely stopped feeling himself to be separate from the world he moved through. The water in the river and the water in the dipper were not two different things to him. They were one thing in two temporary arrangements, and the temporary arrangement of the dipper was simply that, temporary. It would end. The water would return. The bridge was named for this. Not for a teaching Dogen gave, not for a text he wrote, but for a gesture he made daily, quietly, at the river's edge. The half-dipper returned to the water. The bridge named after the returning. Now look up at the waterfall again. The water at the top has not yet separated. It is still the river, one continuous body, moving together, undivided. At the top, the river has no individual drops. It has no sense of being many things. It simply is what it is, whole, moving, without the experience of boundary or separation. Then it goes over the edge, And in the falling, something changes. The wind catches it. The air breaks it apart. The single river becomes thousands of individual drops, each one now tracing its own path, each one now carrying, if we allow the imagination to follow the teaching, something like an individual experience. The experience of falling, the experience of the air pressing from all sides, the experience of distance from the river above and the river below, the experience, perhaps, of something like difficulty. The teaching here is not a metaphor being imposed on water. It is an observation about what separation does. Before the separation, there is no individual feeling. There is only the river, being the river, in the way that rivers simply are. After the separation, in the falling, in the distance, in the breaking apart, something that functions like individual experience begins. This is what birth is. This is what a human life is. The river going over the edge, the whole becoming temporarily many, each drop briefly, completely, its own distinct falling thing, with its own trajectory, its own weight, its own experience of the distance between where it started and where it will land. And the difficulty we feel, the suffering that arrives with consciousness and separation and individual existence, this is the difficulty of the drop in the air. Real, genuinely felt, not to be minimized or explained away, but understood now in its context. The difficulty belongs to the separation, not to the water itself, not to whatever we are before and after the falling. Before we were born, we were one with the universe. This is not a poetic sentiment. It is the most literal statement the teaching can make. Whatever we are, whatever consciousness is, whatever this experience of being alive amounts to, it arose from something, and that something was not separate from the rest of what exists. The river before the edge, the hole before the falling, the water before it learned the word drop. And after the falling ends, the drop returns. Not to nothing, not to absence or void, or the extinction of everything that the drop was during its time in the air, to the river, to the wholeness it came from, to the condition before separation, which is also the condition after it. Consider how the water must feel if we follow the image honestly when it lands. The falling is over. The separation is ending. The boundary between this drop and all the other drops is dissolving as each one meets the pool below and becomes indistinguishable from what it joins. The individual trajectory is complete. The individual weight is released. The individual experience of the air pressing from all sides is finished. What returns is composure. Not the composure of endurance, the gritted composure of someone who has held together through difficulty, the composure of return, the composure of the river finding itself whole again, one body, moving together, the individual drops reunited in something larger than any of them were during the falling. How glad the water must be. This phrase is not sentimental. It is pointing at something precise. The gladness is not an emotion assigned to water by a mind that needs comfort. It is the recognition of what return actually is, the ending of the effort of separation, the release of the tension that individual existence requires, the composure that was always available and becomes fully available again when the falling is done. Life and death are the same thing. This is the teaching that most people hear as philosophy and feel unable to receive as comfort, because the thinking mind takes the two words, life and death, and places them at opposite ends of a spectrum, one desirable and one to be feared, one to be extended and one to be postponed. And the teaching says, they are the same water, different arrangements of the same thing, different moments in the same movement, the river and the drop and the river again. When this lands not as a concept but as a felt experience, and it can, if the image is stayed with honestly, what arrives is not morbidity or resignation. What arrives is rest, a particular quality of rest that is different from anything that ordinary comfort can produce, because ordinary comfort is given to a self that is still separate, still falling, still in the middle of its trajectory between the river above and the river below. This is something quieter than comfort, the recognition that the falling itself is held, that what falls is not falling away from something but falling toward it, that the drop has never, not for a single moment of its falling, stopped being water. Dogen returned the water in the dipper because he knew this, not as a doctrine he had accepted, as a felt reality that expressed itself naturally in the act of returning. The water in the dipper was him. The river was him. The returning was not generosity. It was recognition. The river acknowledging itself in the dipper and inviting itself home. The bridge at Aheji still stands. People still cross it. The stream still moves beneath it, the same stream that moved beneath it in Dogen's time, carrying water that has been rain and river and ocean and cloud and rain again in the centuries since. The water does not remember its previous arrangements. The water simply continues, taking whatever form the conditions require, releasing that form when the conditions change, moving always toward the lower place, which is also always the returning place. There is a practice that emerges naturally from this, though it requires no formal instruction. When the fear of ending arrives, and it arrives for everyone, in whatever form it takes for each particular drop, the practice is simply to look at the water. Not metaphorically, actually, if possible, a river, a stream, rain on a window, water running from a tap. Watch what it does. Watch how completely it gives itself to whatever shape contains it. Watch how completely it releases that shape when the container changes. Watch how it finds its way always toward joining, always toward the larger body, always toward the condition of being undivided. The water is not afraid of this. The water has never been afraid of this. The water in the dipper does not resist the returning. The drop in the air does not refuse to land. The river at the edge does not hold back from the falling. Each movement, each change of form, each apparent ending is also a beginning, not as consolation, but as structure, as the actual nature of what water is and does and always has been. We are the water. This is the teaching in its simplest possible form, not as metaphor, not as comfort dressed as philosophy, but as the most direct statement available about the nature of individual existence and what it is continuous with. We are temporarily in the dipper. We are temporarily the drop in the air. We have always been the river. We will be the river again. And right now, in this moment, in this particular arrangement of water that is briefly, completely, a listening human being, the river is here too. Not waiting at the other end of the falling. Here, in the drop, in the breath, in the simple fact of being alive and aware and present in this moment, which is itself the river, knowing itself through the experience of a drop. The Half-Dipper Bridge stands at the entrance to the monastery because this is the teaching that everything else rests on. Before you enter the monastery, you cross the bridge. Before you sit, before you bow, before you study, before you practice any of the things that practice asks of you, you cross the bridge that is named for the returning. The reminder is built into the threshold. You came from somewhere whole. You are going somewhere whole. And what you are doing right now, in the falling, in the individual trajectory of this particular life, this too is the river, knowing itself in a new way. There is no fear in this when it is genuinely felt. There is something much quieter than fear, the composure of water that knows what it is, regardless of what shape it is currently taking. The gladness of the drop approaching the river below. The rest that comes not from avoiding the falling but from understanding, all the way to the body, what the falling is part of. Life and death are the same water. The river and the drop are the same river. The half-dipper, returned, becomes what it always was. And what it always was is what you have always been, even now, even here, even in the middle of the falling, even before you knew there was a bridge named for the returning. The question that opens from here is the simplest one available. If the drop is already the river, if the separation is real but not final, if difficulty belongs to the falling and not to the water itself, then how should a drop live while it is falling? What does complete presence look like for a being that is briefly, entirely, its own distinct thing? The answer, it turns out, has been sitting by a pond this whole time, doing absolutely nothing special and not even knowing it. There is a frog sitting by a pond. He is not doing anything remarkable. He is simply sitting, weight settled, eyes open, body still in the particular way that frog bodies are still, which is not the stillness of effort but the stillness of a creature that has never once questioned whether sitting is what it should be doing right now. He does not have a meditation timer. He does not have a cushion. He has not read anything about correct posture or the importance of keeping the spine straight or the value of returning attention to the breath when the mind wanders. He is simply here, at the edge of the pond, in the precise posture that centuries of Zen practitioners have spent enormous effort trying to achieve. And he has no idea. This is the thing that makes the frog so useful as a teaching. Not his posture, though the posture is genuinely remarkable when you look at it honestly. His complete absence of self-consciousness about the posture. The frog does not sit and then assess his sitting. He does not compare this session to yesterday's session. He does not wonder whether he is making progress or losing ground, or whether some other frog somewhere is sitting better than he is. He simply sits because he is a frog, and this is what frogs do, and there is no gap between the frog and the sitting, no space where a watcher has set up residence to monitor how the whole thing is going. When something interesting happens, a fly passes within range, he snaps at it, completely, with no division between the frog and the snapping. And then he is sitting again, the same frog, the same stillness, as if the snapping and the sitting are not two different modes, but simply two expressions of the same unfragmented being. This is Zazen, not the performance of Zazen, not the aspiration towards Zazen. Zazen itself, the actual thing, in its natural form, demonstrated without any awareness of the demonstration by a creature that has never heard the word and would not be impressed by it if he had. The teaching that this frog embodies has a precise formulation that is worth sitting with slowly. When you become you, Zazen becomes Zazen. Not, when you practice long enough, you will become enlightened. Not, when you correct your posture and quiet your mind and follow the instructions carefully, something will eventually click into place. When you become you, when the gap between the person and the action closes, when the watcher folds back into the living and stops standing apart to monitor whether the living is being done correctly, the frog is always you. This is the point the teaching will not let go of. When the frog is fully the frog, which the frog always is, because the frog has no mechanism for being anything other than fully the frog. Everything the frog does is an expression of its complete nature. The sitting and the snapping and the returning to stillness are all, equally, the frog. There is no hierarchy. There is no moment when the frog is more itself than in other moments. It is simply and entirely itself, all the time, without effort, without the concept of effort, without the concept of being without effort. Now bring this into the shape of a human life. The gap the frog does not have is the gap most people live inside, constantly. The gap between what is happening and the self that is watching what is happening and deciding whether it meets the standard. The gap between the person eating and the watcher monitoring whether the eating is mindful enough. The gap between the person resting and the watcher calculating whether enough has been accomplished to justify the rest. The gap between the person sitting in meditation and the watcher evaluating the quality of the sitting and comparing it to some imagined ideal of what sitting should look like. This gap is not a character flaw. It is the gap that human consciousness creates by its very nature, the capacity to reflect, to evaluate, to stand back from immediate experience and observe it. This capacity is also what allows art and language and kindness and the accumulation of wisdom across generations. It is not the enemy, but when it runs without rest, when the watcher never stands down, when every moment of living is also a moment of being watched and assessed and found adequate or inadequate, that is the exhaustion the frog knows nothing about. The practice the Zen tradition points toward is not the elimination of the reflective capacity. It is the development of enough settledness that the watcher can occasionally rest, that the gap can occasionally close, that you can be, even briefly, as fully yourself as the frog is fully itself, not because you have achieved something the frog has not, but because you have stopped achieving, stopped monitoring the achieving, stopped assessing the quality of the stopping. Just this, just here, just the weight of the body and the movement of the breath and the particular quality of this moment, which has never existed before and will never exist again, and is, right now, complete. There is a different kind of naturalness that the teaching is pointing at here. Not the naturalness of doing whatever you feel like, of following every impulse without reflection, of using the concept of natural as permission to remain exactly as you are, without any effort toward anything. That is not what the frog demonstrates. The frog does not sit because sitting feels good in the moment. The frog sits because sitting is the expression of what the frog is. There is no deliberation. There is no alternative being weighed. There is simply the expression of nature meeting conditions, the frog, the pond, the particular afternoon, the fly that may or may not pass, and the expression is complete because nothing in it is withheld. Think of a seed. The seed does not deliberate about becoming a plant. It does not weigh the advantages and disadvantages of germination. It does not worry about whether it is the right kind of seed for this particular soil. The conditions arrive: moisture, warmth, darkness, time, and the seed does what seeds do, completely, without reservation, without the concept of reservation. The plant that emerges is exactly what the seed was, expressed in the form that the conditions allowed. Nothing added, nothing withheld. This is the naturalness the teaching is pointing at. Not carelessness. The seed is not careless. Not effortlessness in the sense of nothing happening. The seed does extraordinary work in its germination. The plant does extraordinary work in its growing. But the work arises from nature meeting conditions, not from a self standing apart from nature and deciding how much of it to express and under what circumstances. When you are you in this sense, when the expression is complete, when nothing is being withheld for assessment or approval, then whatever you do carries the quality of the frog's sitting. Not because you have become enlightened, not because the practice has finally produced the result you are working toward, but because you are the result. You always were. The frog has been demonstrating this at the edge of the pond since before the teaching existed to describe it. Now there is a second figure in this final teaching, smaller than the frog, less comic, more intimate. There was a Zen master who lived alone in a small zendo. His name was Zhuan, and Zhuan had a practice that seems, at first, almost absurd. Throughout the day, without warning, without apparent occasion, he would call out his own name. Zhuan. And then, in the same voice, he would answer, yes. That was the whole practice. A name called into the silence of a small room. An answer returned. The one calling and the one answering the same person. Alone, with no audience, and no purpose beyond the calling and the answering themselves. This practice had a specific function. Zhuan called his own name when he noticed he had drifted. Not drifted into sleep or distraction in any dramatic sense. Drifted from himself. Drifted into the place where the living is happening, but the person is not quite present for it. The place where the body is here, but the attention has gone somewhere else. Into a loop, into a worry, into the past, or the future, or the imagined opinion of someone not present. When Zhuan noticed this drift, he called himself back, with his own name, and answered with the only honest response to one's own name. Yes. Here, present, the gap closed, at least for this moment, by the simple act of a name and its answer. There is something in this practice that is available to everyone, in whatever form fits. Not necessarily the calling of a name aloud in an empty room, though that is its own kind of effective, but the quality of return that the practice embodies, the recognition that presence is not a permanent achievement, but a recurring orientation, something returned to rather than arrived at, something practiced not once, but continuously, in the way that Dogen's vows are practiced, in the way that the fourth horse keeps running, in the way that the forehead keeps returning to the floor. Zhuan. Yes. Here. Not patience. The teaching uses a different word. Constancy. Patience implies endurance, the gritting of teeth, the waiting out of something difficult, the white-knuckled maintenance of composure until conditions improve. Patience is still hoping for a different moment than this one. Patience looks at the present moment and says, I will tolerate this until something better arrives. Constancy is different in its entire orientation. Constancy does not wait for better conditions. Constancy is the quality of returning, again and again, to what is actually here, without the verdict on what is here, without the assessment of whether what is here is adequate, without the comparison to what was here yesterday, or what might be here tomorrow. Constancy is Zhuan calling his own name in the small room and meaning it every time, not because the small room has become a better room, because the small room is the room, and Zhuan is in it, and yes is the only true answer to that fact. This is what the frog has, Not patience with the pond, constancy with the pond, complete, unconditional, unevaluated presence with the pond, with the afternoon, with the fly that comes or does not come, with the stillness that is not performed but simply is. And this is what the entire journey of these 3 hours has been building toward, not as a destination that has now been reached, but as a recognition that has been slowly becoming available. The beginner's mind that keeps the door open, the breath that crosses the boundary between inside and outside, the meadow that holds the sheep without a fence, the weeds pressed into the soil near the root, the fourth horse running all the way to the marrow, the callus built by 10,000 mornings of return, the railway track, same width, through every kind of terrain, the bonfire that burns without smoke, the drop that was always the river, all of it, every teaching, every image, every story, pointing here. To the frog at the edge of the pond, to Zwan in the small room, calling his own name, to the simple, radical, endlessly available fact of being present for your own life, not because you have finally achieved the right conditions for presence, but because presence is what you are when the watcher rests and the gap closes and the name is called and the only true answer comes back. Yes. What does this look like in the life you are actually living? Not in a monastery, not in extraordinary circumstances, in the ordinary texture of days that are mostly unremarkable and sometimes difficult and occasionally, briefly, luminous in a way that the thinking mind is too busy to notice. It looks like this. You are doing something ordinary, washing a cup, walking from one room to another, sitting in a car waiting for something, lying in bed in the particular darkness before sleep arrives. And for a moment, not a dramatic moment, not a moment marked by anything external, the watcher steps back. The assessment stops. The comparison to yesterday and the calculation about tomorrow and the monitoring of whether this is going well enough, all of it, just for this moment, simply stops. And there is just the cup, just the walking, just the darkness before sleep, just this, complete, sufficient, requiring nothing added to it and nothing removed from it to be exactly what it is. This is what the frog knows. This is what Zhuan kept calling himself back to. This is what the teaching means when it says nothing special, because what is being pointed at is so completely ordinary, so entirely available, so utterly without requirement or prerequisite, that the word special would only mislead. Nothing special, which is, it turns out, everything. The frog is still there, at the edge of the pond, still sitting in his perfect, unremarkable posture, still completely, entirely, without any awareness of the fact, himself. He will be there tomorrow. He will be there the day after, not because he is committed to the practice of being there, because he is the frog, and this is the pond, and the afternoon is this afternoon, and there is nothing else required. You are the frog, not as a metaphor, as a reminder of what is already true about you when the watcher rests, when the assessment stops, when the name is called, and the only answer is the honest one. Yes. Here. This. Exactly this. Nothing added. Nothing missing. The pond and the frog and the afternoon, and the absolute sufficiency of what already is. You are still here. Not here as an achievement. Not here because you followed the teachings correctly, or understood everything, or arrived at some new and better version of yourself over the last 3 hours. Here in the simplest possible sense, breathing, weighted, present in a body that has been quietly, faithfully, doing its work this entire time, without once asking for your supervision. The breath is still moving, the same breath that was moving at the beginning. The swinging door, opening and closing, inside meeting outside, the boundary crossing itself with each inhale and each exhale, the way it has been crossing since the first breath and will continue until the last. Nothing about this has changed, and yet something in the quality of noticing it may feel different now, quieter, more like coming home than arriving somewhere new. That is the only destination this teaching has ever pointed toward. Not enlightenment as a trophy, not peace as a permanent weather system, just this, the simple, radical return to what was always here. The frog is still at the edge of the pond. Zwan is still in his small room, ready to call his own name the moment he drifts. The water is still falling, and landing, and returning. And you are here, exactly here, which has always been, and remains, enough.